The crystal chandelier cast a galaxy of fractured light across the ballroom, each sparkle a tiny, mocking reminder of the world Grace Morgan had lost. Her hands, calloused from cleaning solutions and rough from wringing out mop heads, felt raw and clumsy, clutching the delicate stem of a champagne flute. She was here because her childhood friend, Jessica, now a socialite with a new last name, had insisted. "It'll be fun, Gracie. A night out." But it wasn't fun. It was torture. Her simple, second-hand black dress, the nicest thing she owned, felt like a costume of poverty amidst the sea of designer gowns. She was a ghost, haunting a party she had no right to attend, and everyone knew it. She was trying to make herself invisible near a towering floral arrangement when she saw him. Logan, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had promised her a future of literary salons and academic prestige before brutally dumping her when her family's money ran out. He was here, laughing with his new fiancée, the heiress he had been cheating on her with. He spotted her. A cruel, smug smile spread across his handsome face as he sauntered over, his new fiancée clinging to his arm. "Well, well," Logan said, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Grace Morgan, I almost didn't recognize you without a cleaning cart. Tell me, are you enjoying your night off?" The small group around them chuckled. A hot, suffocating wave of humiliation washed over Grace. "Look at you," he continued, his eyes raking over her simple dress with disdain. "From the university library to the trash can. I told you you'd be nothing without me." Her heart shattered. She wanted to run, to disappear, to scream. But she was frozen, pinned by the weight of his cruelty and the pitying stares of the crowd. Her eyes, burning with unshed tears of rage and shame, darted across the room, searching for any escape. And then they met his. Across the room, leaning against a marble pillar, was a man who seemed to exist in his own pocket of silence and power. Salvatore Sal Moretti, the heir to the Moretti crime family, the most feared and respected name in Chicago's underworld. Jessica had pointed him out earlier, her voice a hushed whisper of awe and fear. He was dark, impossibly handsome, and radiated an aura of such intense, quiet authority that it made the air around him feel different. He was watching the scene unfold, his expression completely, unnervingly unreadable. Logan, drunk on his own arrogance, leaned in for one final killing blow. "Still waiting for Prince Charming to rescue you, Grace," he sneered. Something inside Grace snapped. It wasn't a thought. It was a pure, primal instinct for survival, for revenge. In a move that stunned everyone, including herself, she turned away from Logan. She marched across the ballroom, her path a straight, unwavering line to the most dangerous man in the room. Salvatore watched her approach, his dark eyes tracking her every move, a flicker of curiosity in their depths. He didn't move as she stopped directly in front of him. Without a word, she reached up, grabbed the lapels of his expensive, custom-made suit, and pulled his face down to hers. And she kissed him. It was a desperate, furious, reckless kiss. For a split second, he was still, surprised by her audacity. Then she felt his hand come up to the small of her back, pulling her closer, responding to her kiss with a controlled, possessive pressure. The ballroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. She broke the kiss, breathless, and turned to face a gobsmacked Logan. Her eyes, no longer filled with tears, were blazing with a triumphant wildfire. "He's not a prince," she announced, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the silence. "He's my fiancé." Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from right now? I love connecting with our amazing audience from around the world, and don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. Let's continue. The silence in the ballroom was a tangible thing, a collective held breath. Logan stared, his face a comical mixture of shock and dawning, abject terror, as he finally, truly recognized the man whose kiss Grace had just stolen. Salvatore didn't release her. Instead, his arm tightened possessively around her waist, pulling her firmly against his side. He looked from Grace's defiant, flushed face to Logan's pale one. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a smile that did not reach his eyes, "Darling," he said, his voice a low, smooth purr that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He addressed the word to Grace, but his cold, dark eyes were locked on Logan. "I don't believe you've introduced me to your friend." The implication was clear. "You are nothing to me." "He's no one," Grace replied, playing her part, her voice dripping with a dismissive scorn that twisted the knife in Logan's gut. "Ah," Salvatore nodded slowly. He gave Logan one last, lingering look, a look that was a silent, brutal promise of consequences, before turning his full attention back to Grace. "In that case, shall we get some air?" He guided her away from the scene, his hand a warm, firm brand on her back. As they walked, the whispers erupted behind them like wildfire. She could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The pitying, scornful stares had been replaced by looks of shock, envy, and fear. She was no longer the invisible cleaning girl. She was the fiancée of Salvatore Moretti. The power was a dizzying, intoxicating drug. He led her to a secluded, moonlit balcony overlooking the city. The cool night air was a welcome relief against her heated skin. "That was a bold move, Grace," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. He leaned against the balustrade, turning to face her. "He deserved it," she said, her chin held high, though her heart was still hammering against her ribs. "He did," Salvatore agreed, "but you didn't just humiliate him. You tied yourself to me in front of the most powerful people in this city. That is a dangerous thing to do." "I'm aware," she said, meeting his gaze. "What happens now?" "Now," he said, a glint of amusement in his eyes, "we decide how far you want to take this little play of yours." He paused, his gaze intense. "Your revenge against that boy isn't finished, is it? You don't just want him to feel fear. You want him to feel regret. You want him to spend weeks, months, wondering what he lost. You want him to believe this is real." He had read her perfectly, seeing the deep, vengeful desire beneath her desperate act. "Yes," she whispered, the single word a raw, honest confession. He pushed himself off the balustrade and moved closer, his larger frame eclipsing the city lights, his expensive cologne wrapping around her, clouding her senses. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Then stay with me tonight," he whispered, his voice a silken, dangerous invitation. "Let them see you leave with me. Let them see my car outside your apartment in the morning. By tomorrow, the entire city will know that you are mine." She stared up at him, her breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment of no return. She was making a deal with the devil, trading one night for the satisfaction of her revenge. She knew the risks. She knew this man was a predator, a king in a world of violence and shadows. But the memory of Logan's cruel laughter, the sting of her public humiliation, was a fire in her veins. She thought of her grandfather, of the mounting bills, of her life spent scrubbing other people's floors. For one night, she wanted to be the one who held the power. She met his dark, waiting gaze. "I'll stay." Grace awoke with a start, the morning sun streaming through a gap in heavy silk curtains. For a moment, she was completely disoriented. The bed she was in was enormous, the sheets impossibly soft, the thread count higher than any number she could imagine. The room was a study in masculine luxury, dark wood, polished chrome, and a breathtaking floor-to-ceiling window that revealed a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline from what must have been the highest point in the city. She was alone. She sat up, clutching the silk shirt she was wearing. It was his. It smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent of sandalwood and power. The memories of the previous night were a hazy, intoxicating blur of champagne, adrenaline, and the dizzying feeling of his arm around her waist. He had brought her here, to his penthouse, and had shown her to this guest suite with a detached courtesy. "You'll be comfortable here," was all he had said, before disappearing into his own wing of the vast apartment. There had been no seduction, no further demands. He had simply given her a safe, luxurious place to land. Driven by a restless curiosity, she slipped out of bed and began to explore. The penthouse was less a home and more a corporate headquarters, a testament to a life of control and solitude. The art on the walls was modern and expensive, the furniture minimalist and severe. There were no family photos, no personal trinkets, no sign of a life lived with others. She found him in his office, a vast room with a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black marble. He was standing by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, already dressed in a sharp, dark suit, looking out at the city he owned. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, even rumble. "I trust you slept well." "I did," she replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious in his oversized shirt. "Thank you." "The news of our engagement is already the lead story on every society blog in the city," he said, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. He gestured to his phone on the desk. "Your ex-boyfriend, Logan, has already called my office 3 times this morning, begging to speak with me. I believe your revenge has been adequately served." A thrill of satisfaction shot through her, quickly followed by a wave of uncertainty. The game was over. "So, our one-night deal is finished," she said, stating the fact, though it felt like a question. "It is," he agreed. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes studying her over the rim of the cup. "However, I have a new proposal for you." He set his cup down. "Our little charade last night, it was useful. It provided a convenient distraction from some of my less public business dealings. A high-profile engagement is a very effective smokescreen." He walked around his desk and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "Continue to be my fiancée. For 6 months. Play the part of the adoring bride-to-be in public. In exchange, I will take care of all of your grandfather's medical expenses. The best doctors. The best facilities. He will want for nothing. And you," he added, his gaze sweeping over her, "will be given a life you have, until now, only read about in the books you seem to love." Grace was stunned. She had expected to be dismissed, a pawn whose purpose had been served. Instead, he was offering her a golden cage, but it was a cage that came with the key to her grandfather's health and well-being. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why me?" "Because you amuse me," he answered, his voice deceptively simple. "You are intelligent, you are bold, and you are not easily intimidated. That is a rare combination." He paused. "And because it is useful to have a fiancé that no one saw coming. It keeps my enemies off balance." She thought of her grandfather, of his tired eyes, of the constant worry that shadowed his face. This was a chance to give him peace, to give him the best care money could buy. It was a deal with the devil, but the devil was offering a piece of heaven. "I accept," she said, her voice firm, "but I have a question." "Oh? What are the rules?" A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. "The rules are simple, Grace," he said, pushing himself off the desk and walking toward her. He stopped directly in front of her, his presence overwhelming. "Rule number 1, he whispered, his voice a low, intimate command. "In public, you adore me. You are the loving, devoted fiancé. In private, you do not ask me questions about my business or my life. You see nothing, you hear nothing." He leaned in closer, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You are a beautiful, brilliant distraction. Play your part well, and you will be rewarded. That is all you need to know." The moment Grace accepted his proposal, the world as she knew it ceased to exist. Salvatore's transformation of her was swift, efficient, and utterly disorienting. Within hours, a team of stylists, tailors, and consultants descended upon the penthouse. Her simple, worn-out wardrobe was replaced by a closet filled with designer clothes, elegant shoes, and understated, expensive jewelry. A quiet, severe woman named Elena was assigned to her, a tutor in the subtle arts of high society, which fork to use, how to descend a staircase, how to convey polite dismissal with a single, cool glance. Salvatore was the architect of this new Grace, molding her into the perfect Mafia fiancé. He was a demanding, exacting creator. "No, not that dress," he would say, dismissing a couture gown with a wave of his hand. "It's too loud. You are not seeking attention. You command it quietly." "Your posture, Grace," he would correct, his voice sharp. "Shoulders back. You are not a servant asking for permission. You are my future wife. You own every room you walk into." It was exhausting, dehumanizing, and yet, in a strange way, empowering. She was being stripped of her old self, but the new one he was building was strong, polished, and confident. Her first true test came a week later. It was a dinner at Salvatore's private, heavily guarded restaurant, a place where the city's real power was brokered over plates of pasta and glasses of vintage Barolo. It was a dinner with his capos, his captains, the lieutenants of his criminal empire. Grace was terrified. These were not the soft, arrogant men from the charity gala. These were hard men with cold eyes and scars on their knuckles, men who had earned their place at this table through loyalty and, she had no doubt, violence. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, her hair styled in a sophisticated chignon. She was the picture of quiet grace, but inside, her heart was a frantic drum. She sat by Salvatore's side, a silent, beautiful accessory, just as he had instructed. For most of the dinner, she was ignored. The men spoke in a rapid, coded mix of Italian and English, discussing business she was not meant to understand. She listened, smiled politely, and used her literary intelligence to survive. She thought of herself as a character in a Shakespearean tragedy, a pawn in a court of dangerous kings. Then, one of the older capos, a man with a weathered face and surprisingly kind eyes named Leo, turned to her. "So, Salvatore tells us you enjoy books, Miss Morgan." "I do," she replied, her voice steady. "A woman of intellect. A rare quality," Leo said, taking a sip of his wine. "Machiavelli once wrote that it is better to be feared than loved. Do you agree?" It was a test. All eyes were on her. She felt Salvatore tense beside her. She met Leo's gaze directly. "I think Machiavelli was a pragmatist," she said, her voice clear and calm. "But he also understood that fear is a volatile tool. It can inspire obedience, but it never inspires loyalty. Love, or at least respect, is a much more stable foundation for power." A slow smile spread across Leo's weathered face. He raised his glass to her. "To a stable foundation," he said, and the other capos murmured their assent. She had passed, but not everyone was impressed. A younger, more brutish capo named Marco, who had been staring at her with open hostility all night, let out a derisive snort. "A stable foundation," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "She talks of foundations, but what does she know? She comes from nothing. A cleaning girl, I hear. What does a Moretti need with a woman who smells of bleach?" The insult hung in the air, crude and shocking. The table fell silent. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Salvatore didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Marco. He simply, slowly, placed his hand over Grace's where it rested on the table. His touch was warm, steady, a silent anchor in the sudden, cold storm. He then lifted his gaze and fixed it on Marco. His eyes, usually so unreadable, were now filled with a chilling, lethal calm. "My fiancé," Salvatore said, his voice dangerously quiet, each word a perfectly aimed bullet, "has more class, more intelligence, and more honor in her little finger than your entire bloodline has produced in 100 years, Marco." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Remember that." Marco visibly paled, a flicker of fear in his eyes. He mumbled an apology and looked down at his plate, utterly defeated. The conversation at the table resumed, but the message had been sent. She was his. An attack on her was an attack on him. Salvatore's hand remained on hers for the rest of the dinner. His silent, absolute protection was more powerful than any shouted threat could ever have been. And as she sat there, his warmth seeping into her skin, Grace felt an unexpected, treacherous shiver run through her. She was beginning to see the man behind the monster, the king behind the killer, and it was a terrifying and thrilling sight to behold. The luxury care facility where Grace's grandfather now lived was a world away from the cramped, dusty apartment he had called home. It was a place of serene gardens, attentive staff, and the quiet hum of top-of-the-line medical equipment. It was all paid for by Salvatore. A golden cage for her grandfather, just as the penthouse was for her. Grace visited him every week, the trip always made in one of Salvatore's black cars, with a quiet, watchful driver. Her grandfather, Arthur, was physically better. The constant stress of poverty and medical bills had been lifted, and the color had returned to his cheeks. But his spirit was a different story. A deep, unsettling anxiety seemed to have taken root in him, an anxiety that had started the day he learned the name of her fiancée. "Gracie," he said during one of her visits, his voice a low, urgent whisper as he glanced nervously toward the door. "This man, this Moretti, his family name is a dangerous one. You must be careful." "I'm fine, Grandpa," she reassured him, forcing a smile. "Salvatore is good to me. He's taking care of everything." "Some debts are too high to pay," Arthur muttered, his gaze distant and troubled. He looked at her, his eyes focusing on the small, simple locket she always wore around her neck. It had been a gift from him on her first birthday, he'd always told her, a trinket he'd bought at a flea market. It was old, silver, and wouldn't open. She had worn it her entire life. "Your locket," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You're still wearing it." "Good, good." "Of course," she said, touching the cool metal. "I never take it off." He leaned forward, his old, frail hand gripping her arm with surprising strength. His eyes were wide with a fear she didn't understand. "Listen to me, Grace. Never take it off. And never, ever let them know what's inside it. Do you understand me? Promise me." "Grandpa, what are you talking about?" she asked, confused. "It doesn't even open. It's just a piece of jewelry." "Promise me," he insisted, his voice cracking with a desperate urgency. Before Grace could press him further, a cheerful nurse bustled into the room with his afternoon medication. "Time for our nap, Arthur," she said, her professional smile not quite masking the end-of-visit finality in her tone. Her grandfather's brief moment of agitation passed as the nurse administered his pills. His eyes grew heavy, and he soon drifted off to sleep, leaving Grace sitting by his bed, her mind reeling. She looked down at the locket resting against her chest. For 24 years it had been a simple, sentimental object, a connection to the grandfather who had raised her. Now his strange, fearful words had transformed it. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a secret. Why was he so afraid of the Moretti name? And what could possibly be inside this tiny, sealed piece of silver that was so important, so dangerous, that he had kept it from her entire life? The mystery of her own past, a past she had always believed to be simple and unremarkable, suddenly felt as dark and complex as the world she had just entered. The rule number 1, "You do not ask me questions," had been a wall between them, a constant reminder of the transactional nature of their relationship. But after the dinner with his capos, after his silent, deadly defense of her, Grace found the rule harder to obey. She was no longer just afraid of him. She was intensely, maddeningly curious. Her chance to break the rule came late one night. She couldn't sleep, her grandfather's strange warning about the locket echoing in her mind. She wandered into the penthouse's vast, silent library, hoping to lose herself in a book. She found Salvatore there. He was not reading. He was standing in the dark, by the massive window overlooking the glittering city, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was staring at a small, silver-framed photograph that he held with a strange, reverent stillness. She watched him from the shadows of the doorway for a long moment. His posture, usually so straight and commanding, was different. There was a slump to his shoulders, a profound sadness that seemed to radiate from him, so potent it was almost a physical presence in the room. Taking a breath, she stepped into the room. "Salvatore," she said softly. He startled, his head snapping up. For a fraction of a second, his face was an open book of raw, unguarded grief before the mask of cool indifference slammed back into place. He quickly placed the photograph face down on a nearby table. "I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice carefully neutral. The old Grace would have apologized and retreated, but the new Grace, the one who had faced down his capos and was now a keeper of her own secrets, stood her ground. She broke the rule. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice gentle, nodding toward the picture frame. He went still, his jaw tightening. She expected a cold dismissal, a sharp reminder of their agreement. Instead, he was silent for a long moment, staring out the window. "My parents," he said finally, his voice a low, rough murmur. He picked up the photograph and turned it toward her. It showed a handsome, smiling man with his arm around a beautiful woman with kind, laughing eyes. They looked happy, vibrant, and full of life. "They were killed," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion, as if he were reciting a historical fact. "A rival family. A hit. I was in the car. I was 8 years old." The confession was so stark, so brutal, it stole the air from Grace's lungs. She could suddenly see it, a small, terrified boy, alone in the back of a car, surrounded by a violence he was too young to understand. The man standing before her, the ruthless, all-powerful ghost of Chicago, had been born in that moment of terror and loss. "They made a mistake," he continued, his voice turning hard as steel. "My father, he trusted the wrong person.
He brought a traitor into his inner circle, and that man sold us out. My father's sentiment, his one moment of weakness, cost him his life. It cost my mother her life." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark, bottomless pits of ancient pain. "That's why I don't trust anyone, Grace. That's why I have rules. Trust is a liability. It's a bullet waiting to be fired." His vulnerability was a physical blow.
It shattered the last of her fear of him, replacing it with a wave of profound, aching empathy. This wasn't a monster. This was a wounded boy who had built a fortress of power and control around his broken heart. Instinctively, without thinking, she closed the space between them. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, over the expensive fabric of his suit. His muscles were tense, hard as rock beneath her touch. "I'm so sorry, Salvatore," she whispered. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up at her face. He didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. For the first time, he let someone touch him in a moment of weakness. He let her in, just a fraction of an inch, past the walls he had spent a lifetime building. And in the quiet of the dark library, with the city lights glittering like fallen stars below them, the foundation of their relationship shifted from a contract of convenience to something far more dangerous and far more real. Hey dear, are you enjoying this story? Don't forget to hit subscribe and help us grow. Thank you for being here. The shared moment of vulnerability in the library became a silent, unspoken secret between them. A new, fragile intimacy bloomed in the sterile air of the penthouse. They started having dinner together every night, not as a duty, but as a choice. The conversations were still careful, but they were no longer empty. They talked about books, about art, about the city spread out below them. He never spoke of his parents again, and she never asked, but the knowledge of his past was a constant, humming presence between them, a bridge of shared understanding. Grace's revenge, the initial catalyst for their entire arrangement, had become a distant memory. The satisfaction she had felt was nothing compared to the complex, confusing, and thrilling emotions Salvatore now evoked in her. But the past, she was about to learn, was not finished with her. One afternoon, she was returning to the penthouse after a supervised visit with her grandfather. As she stepped out of the black car and onto the sidewalk in front of the towering, opulent building, a voice called her name. "Grace?" She turned, and her blood ran cold. It was Logan. Her ex-boyfriend stood there looking disheveled and desperate. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a pathetic, pleading look. "What are you doing here, Logan?" she asked, her voice cold. I had to see you, he said, rushing toward her. Grace, I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Seeing you at that party, with him, it made me realize, I love you. I've always loved you. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Please just talk to me. Forget about him. He's not the man for you. I am. Let go of me, she said, trying to pull her arm away, a feeling of disgust and anger rising in her. It was at that exact moment that another black sedan, sleek and silent, pulled up to the curb. The back door opened, and Salvatore stepped out. He took in the scene in a single, swift glance. Logan's desperate, pleading face, his hand gripping Grace's arm, the distress on her face. A profound, terrifying stillness came over Salvatore. The air around him seemed to drop 20 degrees. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward them, his movements fluid and deliberate, the controlled, lethal grace of a panther closing in on its prey. Logan saw him, and his face went white with terror. He immediately released Grace's arm, taking a stumbling step back. I was just leaving, he stammered. Salvatore didn't even look at him. His dark, intense eyes were locked on Grace, his gaze sweeping over her, checking for any sign of harm. He stopped directly in front of her, his body a solid, protective wall between her and her past. Then, he did something that shattered every rule, every boundary, every last pretense of their arrangement. He reached up, his hand gently cupping her jaw, and he kissed her. It was not the brief, calculated kiss from the dance floor. It was not a performance for an audience. It was a deep, possessive, and undeniably real kiss, right there on the public sidewalk. It was a raw, unfiltered declaration. It was a branding, a claiming, a silent, furious message to Logan and to the entire world. She is mine. He poured all of his pent-up frustration, his jealousy, and the fierce, protective emotion he felt for her into that kiss. Grace's mind went blank, all thought obliterated by the shocking, overwhelming force of his mouth on hers. She melted against him, her hands coming up to grip the front of his suit jacket. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes, dark and stormy with emotion, boring into hers. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he spoke to the terrified man cowering a few feet away. "She's not interested," Salvatore said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "And if I ever see you near her again, you will regret the day you were born." Logan didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled away, disappearing down the street like a frightened rabbit. Salvatore and Grace were left alone on the sidewalk, the sounds of the city fading into a distant hum. The air between them crackled, thick with the aftershock of the kiss. "That," Grace whispered, her voice trembling, "was not for show." "No," he replied, his voice a hoarse rasp. His thumb stroked her cheek, a gesture of pure, unthinking tenderness. "It wasn't." The game was over. The rules were broken. And they both knew, with a terrifying, exhilarating certainty that there was no going back. The kiss on the sidewalk shattered the last remnants of their carefully constructed facade. The unspoken rule, "You do not ask me questions," was now obsolete. The real, unspoken rule was the truth of what they had just shared. They returned to the penthouse not as a boss and his contractual fiancé, but as a man and a woman who had crossed a line from which there was no return. The atmosphere was charged with a new, thrilling and terrifying intimacy. They were acutely aware of each other in a way they hadn't been before. A simple glance across the dinner table held a new weight. A casual brush of hands as they passed in the hallway was a jolt of electricity. Grace was haunted. Haunted by the memory of his kiss, by the raw possessiveness in his eyes, and by the words of her grandfather. Never let them know what's inside. The locket, once a simple piece of her past, now felt heavy against her skin, a burning secret. The fear in her grandfather's eyes, his frantic warning, it was all tangled up with the Moretti name, with the man she was falling in love with. She had to know why. One rainy afternoon, when Salvatore was out for a series of meetings, she sat in the quiet of the grand library, the locket in her hand. She had never tried to open it before. Her grandfather had always told her it was sealed shut. But now, his warning was a challenge. She examined it closely. It was old, the silver worn smooth in places. There was no visible clasp. It seemed to be a solid piece of metal. Frustrated, she ran her thumb over its surface, pressing into the intricate floral engravings. As she pressed down on the center of a tiny carved rose, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible click. Her heart stopped. With trembling fingers, she worked at the tiny seam that had appeared. It was stiff, sealed by decades of disuse. Using the edge of a letter opener from the desk, she carefully pried it open. The locket sprang apart in her palm. Inside, there was no space for a picture. Instead, nestled in the hollowed-out silver, was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile with age. Her hands shook as she carefully unfolded it. It wasn't a note. It was more like a tiny secret pact. On the paper, in a faded, elegant script, were two sets of initials, joined by an ampersand and a date. A.M. Nike. May 1998. Grace stared at the initials, a knot of confusion in her stomach. A.M. and I.C. They meant nothing to her. But the handwriting, there was something vaguely familiar about it. She felt like she had seen it before. She closed her eyes, her mind racing. Where had she seen that elegant, slightly slanted script? And then it hit her. The photograph. The silver-framed picture of Salvatore's parents he had shown her that night in the library. Her heart pounding, she rushed to his office. She knew he kept the photo on his desk now, a silent testament to the vulnerability he had shared with her. She snatched it up. On the back, written in the same faded ink, was a dedication. To my darling husband, on our 5th anniversary. Forever yours, Angela. The handwriting was identical. A.M. Angela Moretti. Grace's blood ran cold. The first set of initials belonged to Salvatore's mother. But who was I.C.? And why would Angela Moretti have a secret pact, sealed in a locket that ended up around Grace's neck? A terrifying, impossible idea began to form in her mind. Her mother's name was Isabella. She had died when Grace was too young to remember, and her grandfather rarely spoke of her. He had always said her last name was Morgan, like his. But what if it wasn't? She looked at the initials again. I.C. Isabella C. The pieces were starting to connect in a way that made her feel dizzy, sick. Her mother wasn't just some unknown woman. She was connected to this world, to the Moretti family. Her grandfather hadn't just been protecting her from a dangerous man. He had been protecting her from her own past, from a secret so deep and so dangerous it had been sealed away for 25 years. And Salvatore, the man she was falling in love with, was standing right in the middle of it. The locket felt like a burning coal in her hand. Grace stood in the center of Salvatore's office, the photograph of his parents in one hand, the tiny, damning piece of paper in the other. The world had tilted on its axis. Her entire life, the simple, tragic story her grandfather had told her, was a lie. She heard the soft chime of the private elevator and knew Salvatore was back. She didn't move. She just waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He walked into the office, a smile on his face when he saw her. "Grace, I was just—" The smile vanished when he saw her expression. He saw the photograph, the open locket, the terror in her eyes. His own face went pale. "What is this, Salvatore?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper. She held out the tiny piece of paper. A.M. and I.C. Angela Moretti. And who? Who is I.C.? Salvatore stared at the locket in her other hand, a look of stunned recognition on his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It was my mother's," she said, her voice breaking. "My grandfather gave it to me. My mother. Her name was Isabella." The name hung in the air between them, a ghost from a past he had never known. Salvatore sank into the chair behind his desk, running a hand over his face. He looked shaken, utterly thrown. "My mother," he began, his voice rough, "had a best friend. They grew up together. They were inseparable, like sisters. Her name was Isabella Conti." "Isabella Conti. I see." The confirmation was a physical blow. Grace stumbled back, grabbing the edge of the desk for support. "She disappeared," Salvatore continued, his voice distant, lost in a memory that wasn't his own. "Around the same time my parents were killed. No one ever knew what happened to her. My father's men searched for her for months. It was like she vanished from the face of the earth." "She didn't vanish," Grace whispered, the horrifying truth finally coalescing in her mind. "She ran. She was pregnant. With me." Salvatore looked up at her, his dark eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. "Your mother was Isabella Conti?" "And my father," Grace pressed, her voice rising with a desperate, frantic need to know the final piece of the puzzle. "Who was my father, Salvatore?" He didn't answer. He just stared at her, a look of such profound, gut-wrenching pity on his face that it terrified her more than any answer could have. "Tell me," she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. "Grace," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "The man my father trusted, the man who betrayed him, the man who sold my family to our rivals for a piece of the city. His name was Antonio Conti. He was Isabella's older brother." The world went black. The traitor. The man who had orchestrated the murder of Salvatore's parents. He wasn't just some abstract villain from a story. He was her uncle. "No," she choked out, shaking her head, refusing to believe it. "No, my grandfather said—" "Your grandfather lied," Salvatore said, his voice flat, dead. "He lied to protect you. Not from me. He was protecting you from your own bloodline, from the truth of who your family was." The final, most devastating piece of the puzzle slammed into place. Her mother, Isabella, hadn't just been running from a rival gang. She had been running from her own brother, the man who had murdered her best friend and her husband. She had run to her grandfather, a distant relative, and had made him swear to hide her and her unborn child forever. Grace looked at Salvatore, at the man she loved, and saw him through a new, horrifying lens. She was not just a stranger he had pulled into his world. She was the living, breathing legacy of his family's greatest betrayal, the daughter of his mortal enemy's sister. The revelation was not a bridge between their pasts. It was a chasm, a bloody, bottomless abyss that had just opened up between them, threatening to swallow them both whole. The silence in the office was a living, breathing thing, thick with the ghosts of the past. Grace felt like she was drowning, the weight of her lineage a stone tied to her feet. She was the niece of the man who had murdered Salvatore's parents. The man she loved was, by the brutal code of his world, honor-bound to despise her. "I have to go," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I can't stay here." "Grace, wait," Salvatore said, standing up, his face a mask of conflict and pain. "No," she said, taking a step back away from him. "Don't you see? It's over. It was over before it even began. My entire life has been a lie, and that lie has led me right back here to you. It's like some cruel cosmic joke." She turned and fled, running from his office, from the penthouse, from the man she loved and the impossible, bloody truth that now stood between them. She went straight to the care facility. She needed to see her grandfather, to confront him, to hear the full story from the man who had orchestrated her life of hiding. She found him sitting by the window in his room, looking out at the garden. He looked up as she entered, and he knew immediately that she knew. The secret he had carried for 25 years was written all over her face. "You opened it," he said, his voice a weary, defeated sigh. "He was my uncle," Grace said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The man who killed Salvatore's parents. He was my mother's brother." Her grandfather closed his eyes, the pain of the memory etched on his face. "Yes," he whispered. And then he told her everything. He told her about Isabella, a beautiful, vibrant mother who had been like a daughter to him. He told her about Antonio Conti, Isabella's ambitious, ruthless older brother who had risen through the ranks of the Moretti organization. "Your mother and Angela Moretti were closer than sisters," he said, his voice trembling. "They did everything together. They even fell in love at the same time. Angela with Salvatore's father and your mother. She fell in love with a young soldier in the family, a man named Marco." Grace's heart skipped a beat. Marco, the hostile capo from the dinner. "But Antonio forbade the match," her grandfather continued. "He had bigger plans. He was secretly making a deal with the Falcone family, the Moretti's biggest rivals. He planned to betray the Morettis, take over the organization, and marry Isabella off to the Falcone heir to seal the alliance." He told her how Isabella had discovered the plot. She had tried to warn the Morettis, but she was too late. The ambush was already in motion. "Antonio found out she knew," he said, his voice breaking. "He went after her. Not just to silence her, but because in his twisted mind, she had betrayed the family. She had betrayed him. She was pregnant with Marco's child, and Antonio saw that child, you, as a stain on his honor. Isabella had run, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the locket Angela had given her, a symbol of their sisterhood. She had come to him, her most distant relative, begging him to hide her. "She made me swear," he sobbed, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. "She made me swear that I would raise you as my own, as a Morgan, far from Chicago, far from the Conti name. She knew Antonio would never stop looking for you. She died a few years later, from a broken heart, I think, and I kept my promise. I kept you safe." Grace listened, her own tears falling freely. Her entire life, her quiet, simple existence, had been an act of protection, a shield against the violent world she had been born into. "But he's back, isn't he?" she whispered, a cold dread filling her. "Antonio, that's why you were so scared when you heard the Moretti name. You thought he had found me." Her grandfather nodded, his face ashen. "I read it in a paper a few months ago. He was released from prison. He served time on a lesser charge. They could never prove the murders. He's back in Chicago, trying to rebuild his power." The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The danger wasn't just from Salvatore's world discovering her identity. The real danger, the monster from her mother's past, was out there, and he was looking for her. Her grandfather had not been trying to keep her from Salvatore. He had been trying to keep her from her own uncle, the man who had wanted her dead before she was even born. Hey, if you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. Every like tells me you want more emotional content like this, and it really helps the channel grow. Thank you. The revelation left Grace reeling. She stumbled out of her grandfather's room in a daze, the world tilting on its axis. She was not just the niece of a traitor. She was the target of a monster. Her life wasn't a lie. It was a 25-year head start in a race she didn't even know she was running. She needed to tell Salvatore. The thought was immediate, instinctual. He was the only one who could understand, the only one who could possibly protect her. But as she reached for her phone, a wave of shame and despair washed over her. How could she go back to him now? How could she ask for his protection when her very blood was a reminder of his family's greatest tragedy? Meanwhile, Salvatore was in his own personal hell. Grace was gone. He had let her walk away, his heart shattering with every step she took. He was torn between the ingrained code of his world, where bloodlines were everything, and betrayal was the ultimate sin, and the undeniable, all-consuming love he felt for her. His internal conflict was interrupted by a call from Leo, his oldest and most trusted capo. "Sal," Leo's voice was grim. "We have a problem. Marco is making a move." Salvatore's blood ran cold. Marco, the hostile capo from the dinner, the man her grandfather had said her mother was in love with. "What kind of move?" Salvatore asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "He's been meeting with some of the old guard, the ones who were loyal to Antonio Conti," Leo explained. "He's stirring up trouble. And worse, he knows who Grace is. He's telling everyone you're harboring the niece of the man who killed your father. The betrayal was a sharp, physical blow. Marco wasn't just making a power play. This was personal. He was using Grace, the woman he had once supposedly loved's daughter, as a weapon to destroy Salvatore. "He's calling a meeting of the capos tonight," Leo said. "He's going to challenge you for leadership, using Grace as his justification." Salvatore's mind raced. He had to find Grace. He had to protect her. But as he was about to give the order to his men, his phone rang again. It was an unknown number. He answered, a cold dread creeping up his spine. "Moretti!" a voice sneered on the other end of the line, a voice he hadn't heard in years, but one he would never forget, Antonio Conti. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Conti said, his voice dripping with a possessive, chilling menace. "My niece, my sister's little mistake. I hear she's grown into a beautiful woman. I think it's time for a family reunion." Salvatore's world narrowed to a single point of ice-cold fury. "If you touch her, Conti." "Oh, I won't have to," Conti laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "My new associate is taking care of it for me. A young man who holds a bit of a grudge against you, I believe. A man named Marco. He's picking her up as we speak." Salvatore looked at the GPS tracker on his phone, the one linked to the device he had given Grace. Her signal was moving, heading away from the care facility, toward the industrial warehouse district by the river. The trap had been sprung. Marco wasn't just making a political move. He was delivering Grace to her uncle, to the man who had wanted her dead since before she was born. Grace, leaving the care facility in a daze, didn't see the black car that pulled up beside her until it was too late. The back door opened, and a man stepped out. It was Marco. "Grace," he said, his expression unreadable. "Salvatore sent me. There's been an incident. You need to come with me. It's not safe here." For a split second she felt a wave of relief. Salvatore had sent for her. But then she saw his eyes. They were cold, hard, and empty of the respect he had shown her at the dinner. This was not a rescue. She tried to run, but his men were already there, grabbing her, forcing her into the car. "What are you doing?" she cried, struggling against them. Marco got in beside her, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. "Salvatore made his choice," he said, his voice flat. "He chose a traitor's blood over his own. Now he'll pay the price, and you're going to meet your uncle." The news of Grace's abduction was a spark in a powder keg. Salvatore's grief and conflict vanished, consumed by a singular, ice-cold purpose: get her back. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and Grace was at its epicenter. He arrived at the emergency meeting of his capos, held in the back room of his private restaurant. The air was thick with tension and the smell of betrayal. Marco stood at the head of the table, a smug, triumphant look on his face, flanked by a handful of older capos, men whose loyalty had always been questionable, men from a bygone era who still revered the Conti name. "Salvatore," Marco began, his voice dripping with false respect. "We are here tonight because a disturbing truth has come to light. A truth that questions your leadership, your judgment, and your loyalty to this family." He let the words hang in the air. "You have taken a woman into your home, into your bed. You have named her your fiancée. And we have learned that this woman, Grace Morgan, is not who she seems. She is the niece of Antonio Conti. The blood of the man who murdered your father runs through her veins." A murmur of shock and anger rippled through the room. "You have harbored a snake in our midst," Marco continued, his voice rising. "You have put your personal feelings for a traitor's spawn above the honor of this family. You are compromised. You are weak. You are not fit to lead us." He paused, letting his accusation settle. "I, Marco, whose family has been loyal to the Morettis for generations, invoke the old laws. I challenge your leadership. I say you are no longer our Don." All eyes turned to Salvatore. He stood at the other end of the table, perfectly still, his face an unreadable mask. He let the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping over every man in the room, assessing their loyalty, their fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was filled with a chilling, absolute authority that cut through the tension like a razor. "You are correct about one thing, Marco," Salvatore said, his eyes locking onto his rival. "Grace is the niece of Antonio Conti." He didn't deny it. He owned it. The room fell into a stunned silence. "But you are a fool if you think blood is the only thing that defines a person," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming a low, dangerous growl. "Her father was a traitor. Her mother was a hero who died trying to save my family. Grace has more honor, more loyalty, and more courage in her heart than you could ever comprehend." He took a step forward, his presence seeming to fill the entire room. "You speak of the old laws. Let me remind you of the oldest law. The Don's word is absolute, and I have given my word that she is under my protection." He looked around the room, his gaze a physical force. "She is not just a woman I have taken into my home. She is the woman I have chosen. She is my wife. She is the future of this family. She is a Moretti." The declaration was a thunderclap. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her, bound her to his own name, to his own legacy, in front of them all. "Anyone," he said, his voice now a blade of ice, "who dares to touch her, anyone who sides with the traitor who took her, declares war not just on me, but on the entire Moretti family. There will be no mercy. There will be no quarter." He turned his full, lethal attention back to Marco. "You have made a grave mistake. You have aligned yourself with our greatest enemy. You have kidnapped my wife, and for that, you have forfeited your life." In that moment, Salvatore made his choice. He chose her. He chose love over vengeance, the future over the past. He chose his queen over the archaic, blood-soaked rules of his kingdom. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, his loyal men, led by Leo, falling in step behind him. The war for the soul of the Chicago outfit had just been won. Now, the war to save the woman he loved was about to begin. The warehouse district by the river was a desolate maze of decaying brick and rusted steel, a forgotten corner of the city where shadows clung like old ghosts. Salvatore's car glided to a stop in the darkness a block away from a large, dilapidated warehouse, the only one with a faint, sickly yellow light glowing from its grimy windows. This was not a war of armies. This was an execution. Salvatore didn't bring a crew of soldiers. He brought his 3 most trusted and lethal men, including Leo. They moved through the shadows with a silent, practiced efficiency, specters in the night. Inside the warehouse, Grace was tied to a chair in the center of a large, empty space. Antonio Conti stood before her, a snake in a tailored suit. He was older now, his hair gray, but his eyes held the same cold, reptilian cruelty she had seen in old newspaper clippings. Marco stood beside him, looking nervous, out of his depth. "You have your mother's eyes," Conti said, circling her chair like a vulture. "It's a shame. She was a beautiful girl before she became a traitor, just like you." "I'm nothing like you," Grace spat, her voice filled with a defiance that surprised even herself. Conti laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You are a Conti, and you have something I want, the Moretti Empire. With you as my leverage, Salvatore will have no choice but to cede his territory to me. He will trade his kingdom for his little queen." "You're wrong," Grace said, her chin held high. "He's not coming for his kingdom. He's coming for you." At that exact moment, the main warehouse doors exploded inward with a deafening crash. Chaos erupted. Salvatore's men moved with brutal, surgical precision, neutralizing Conti's guards before they could even react. The cavernous space became a whirlwind of motion and suppressed gunfire. But Salvatore only had eyes for one person. He moved through the chaos like a wraith, a blur of dark motion, his focus absolute. He saw Grace, tied to the chair. He saw Conti, pulling a gun and aiming it at her. Time seemed to slow down. In that split second, as Conti was about to use her as a shield, Grace did something he never expected. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was the daughter of a woman who had defied a monster. With a surge of adrenaline, she kicked her legs out, hooking the leg of the chair around Conti's ankle and pulling with all her might. It was just enough. Conti stumbled, his aim thrown off for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening Salvatore needed. A single silenced shot echoed in the warehouse. Conti crumpled to the ground, a look of shock on his face. Marco, seeing his ally fall, made a desperate move, lunging toward Grace. But Salvatore was already there. He intercepted Marco with a brutal, disarming efficiency, his movements a blur of controlled violence. The fight was over before it had even begun. Marco lay on the ground, disarmed and defeated. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound the ragged breathing of the men left standing. Salvatore didn't even glance at the bodies on the floor. He rushed to Grace, his knife flashing as he cut the ropes that bound her. His hands were shaking. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a raw, desperate rasp. He scanned her for any injury, his hands framing her face. "I'm all right," she whispered, her own adrenaline starting to fade. "We're all right." He pulled her into a desperate, crushing embrace, burying his face in the curve of her neck, his body trembling with the aftershock of his fear for her. He held her as if he could physically absorb her into himself, to keep her safe forever. "I choose you, Grace," he whispered against her skin, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. In front of them, in front of the whole world. Always. "I know," she replied, her arms wrapping tightly around him, her face pressed against his chest. Her faith in him, once a fragile, flickering flame, was now a steady, burning fire. In the middle of the carnage, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, they stood as one, their shared survival a final, binding vow. The return to the penthouse was a world away from their first night there. The silence was not one of tension or unspoken rules, but of a deep, shared peace. The war was over. Antonio Conti was dead. Marco had been exiled, sent away with a fate worse than death in the Mafia world, to live as a nobody, stripped of all power and respect. Salvatore's leadership was absolute, his authority cemented not by fear, but by his unwavering choice to protect his own. They stood in the living room, the city lights glittering below them, the adrenaline of the night finally fading, leaving them exhausted but whole. "My uncle was a monster," Grace said quietly, the words a final acknowledgement of the bloodline she was ready to leave behind. Salvatore turned to her, his expression soft. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "No," he corrected, his voice gentle but firm. "Your uncle was a mistake in our history. Your mother was a hero. And you," he said, his dark eyes filled with a love so profound it was bottomless. "You are my queen." The words, once a part of their public charade, were now the purest truth. He led her to his office, the room where she had first discovered the secrets of their past. He walked to his desk and handed her a small velvet box. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. She opened it. Inside was her locket, the one that had been lost in the chaos at the warehouse. But it was different. It was polished, the silver gleaming, and when she touched the tiny rose in the center, it clicked open easily. The tiny yellowed paper with the initials was gone. In its place, nestled in the silver hollow, was a new, professionally captured photograph, impossibly small. It was a picture of the two of them, taken a few weeks ago at a charity event. They were laughing, looking at each other, the love between them so palpable it was captured even in the tiny image. "To start our own story," he said softly. "A new history for this locket." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. He wasn't just accepting her past, he was helping her rewrite it, to build a new legacy on top of the old one. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice suddenly filled with a nervousness she had never heard from him before. He reached into his pocket, but this time he didn't pull out a weapon or a business document. He pulled out another, smaller velvet box. He got down on one knee. "The most powerful man in Chicago, the ghost, the dawn of the Moretti family, was kneeling before her. "Grace Morgan," he began, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze unwavering. "You came into my life as a game, a beautiful, audacious distraction. You became my partner, my confidant, my strength. You are the only person I have ever trusted, the only person I have ever truly loved." He opened the box. Inside was a stunning, elegant diamond ring, its fire seeming to burn as brightly as the love in his eyes. "Our first engagement was a lie, a contract of convenience. I want to make it real. I want to make you my wife, my partner, my queen in the eyes of God and the world for all of our days. Will you marry me, Grace?" Through her tears, she could only nod, a choked sob of pure, unadulterated happiness escaping her lips. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Salvatore. Always, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. It was not a shackle, not a brand of ownership. It was a promise of a new beginning, a future they would build together, finally free from the ghosts of their past. 1 year later, the garden of the Moretti estate was not the setting for a clandestine meeting or a tense negotiation, but for a celebration of love and power. Their wedding was not the cold, sterile affair in a municipal office, but a breathtaking event under the warm Chicago sun. It was a declaration. The guest list was a carefully curated mix of the city's legitimate elite, judges, politicians, and business titans, and the quiet, watchful capos of the Moretti family, all paying their respects. It was a display of Salvatore's new empire, one where the lines between the underworld and the legitimate world were beginning to blur, guided by his iron will and Grace's compassionate intelligence. Grace was no longer the frightened girl in a second-hand dress. She was a vision in a custom-made gown, confident and radiant, moving through the crowd with an easy grace. She was not just a boss's wife. She was a queen, respected and admired in her own right. Her grandfather, Arthur, sat in the front row, his face full of a peace and happiness she had never seen, as he watched the man who had saved them both marry the granddaughter he adored. From a distance, a disgraced Logan saw the wedding photos splashed across the society pages, a bitter, painful reminder of the woman and the world he had so arrogantly thrown away. Later, as the party continued under a canopy of twinkling lights, Salvatore pulled Grace away to the quiet of the moonlit balcony, the same one where he had first made his dangerous proposal. "A year ago, on a balcony just like this, I asked you to stay with me for a night," he said, his voice a low, warm murmur as he wrapped his arms around her. "And I accepted, planning to use you for my revenge," she confessed, a playful smile on her lips. "And now?" he asked, his dark eyes full of a deep, abiding love. "Now I'm your wife, and I plan to use you for a lifetime of happiness," she replied, her smile turning tender. He laughed, a real, genuine sound of joy. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, sweet kiss, filled with the promise of all their tomorrows. She placed her hand on her stomach, a gentle, protective gesture. It was still their secret, but not for long. A new heir for the Moretti Empire, he had joked earlier that week. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and a fierce, quiet strength. "No," she corrected softly, turning to kiss him again, her hand still resting on the new life they had created. A new beginning for the Moriarty family. The legacy of blood had been washed away, replaced by a legacy of love. The ghost had found his home, and the Queen of Chicago was finally, truly, where she belonged. And that's the end of today's story, my dear. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment telling me what you thought, and share it with a friend. Thank you for keeping me company. See you in the next story.